Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us again. Well, I'm here to introduce our second panel, which is entitled Focus on Marriage and Families. And for the next hour and a half, we're going to be talking about a number of fairly diverse issues that face the gay community. Those might include, but are not limited to, marriage issues, anti-discrimination, adoption, and other things that concern our families. Now, moderating this afternoon's panel will be Maureen Monks. She's also a local attorney here in Cambridge. She is a partner at Butler and Monks and the Women's Law Collective in Cambridge. And she's been a specialist in working for battered women and for the gay and lesbian community. She's a founding member and board member of the Massachusetts Lesbian and Gay Bar Association, and she served as the co-chair of that organization from 1990 to 1994. She's also a cooperating attorney for gay and lesbian advocates and defenders, and she serves as a mentor for the Women's Bar Association's Pro Bono Family Law Project for battered women. So I'd like to introduce Maureen Monks and our afternoon panel. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for coming, and I guess just being here, we're all combating stereotypes on this beautiful spring day. Not all the lesbians are out playing softball, and not all the gay men are out there tending their flower gardens, so it's wonderful to be here, and thank you for breaking that stereotype. I'm going to introduce our panelists today. Unfortunately, Juby Headley wasn't able to join us today due to something unforeseen, but we have two remaining panelists who are excellent, and I have the pleasure of introducing them. Mary Bonato is the Director of Civil Rights at the Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders, New England's public interest law firm, which conducts impact litigation and education on gay, lesbian, bisexual issues and issues concerning HIV and AIDS. And to many of you, Mary needs no introduction. She is nationally known legal expert on many of the issues facing our community. She's been there since 1990 and has been involved in numerous discrimination suits in employment, in family law, criminal censorship, and many other legal matters. Among the cases that you probably are familiar with that Mary's been involved with are the St. Patrick's Day parade case, the fighting against Merrimack, New Hampshire's no promo homo anti-gay curriculum policy, and fighting for many parental rights, and most recently working as co-counsel to the Vermont challenge to the right to marry. To Mary's left, we are pleased to have Andrew Tobias, who many of you may know through the Harvard community. Andrew is a Harvard grad and a Harvard Business School grad. He's an investment banker, and many of you may know him as author of The Best Little Boy in the World. And I know that many people in our community have felt very supported by that book, and many people for many years have seen that book really speaks to their growing up story as well. Mr. Tobias also is an award-winning and distinguished journalist. He's a best-selling author. 3 of his national bestsellers include Fire and Ice, The Only Investment Guide You'll Ever Need, and Getting By on $100,000 a Year. And other sad tales. In the fall this past year, he co-hosted Beyond Wall Street, an 8-part PBS documentary, and he has received the Gerald Leb Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism and the Consumer Federation of America Media Service Awards. So we're very pleased to have Andrew here with us today. So without any further delay, I'll introduce Mary Bonato, who's going to talk about marriage and family law issues.
Hi, do I really need this? Oh, yes, I do, I guess. Sorry. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here on a Saturday. I do want to talk to you about marriage, but also about adoption and how they fit into our struggle for full equality as citizens in this country. And I want to start this whole thing with a little bit of context. I want to take you back to 1981. Hopefully most of you were alive in 1981. In 1981, there was not a single policy or law or ordinance or anything anywhere in this country which recognized a gay and lesbian family as a family. Nothing. Zip. And if you think about the last 17 years, family issues have certainly come to the forefront. And it didn't just happen overnight, it happened through a lot of things. And one, just to continue with the context for a moment, in addition to the fact that there was no recognition of our families as recently as 1981, there was oil on the fire, or however you put it, in 1986, when the United States Supreme Court decided the case of Bowers versus Hardwick. Some of you have certainly heard of that case, right? Yeah, the Georgia sodomy case, where a man, Michael Hardwick, was arrested in his own bedroom for having consensual oral sex with another man. He was arrested, and when his case got to the Supreme Court, he and his lawyers tried to build on, at that point, evolving notions of privacy law, that the government should leave adults to do what they want to do in their intimate relations. And the way his lawyers framed the case was not what was Michael Hardwick doing in his bedroom, but what was the state of Georgia doing in his bedroom. Well, the Supreme Court would have none of it. And in a 5-4 decision, they said there was no connection between homosexual activity on the one hand and family, marriage, or procreation on the other hand. And they said that our claims trying to build on privacy were, quote, facetious at best. Now, I was in law school at that time. I was mad. I was infuriated by that decision. And as Larry Kramer has said, upholding sodomy laws is upholding, criminalizing the right to love. And ever since 1981 and 1986, and in fact always, I think we have been very busy showing the world that in fact we do have families and that there is a connection between gay people and families. And there have been a number of other developments since 1981 that I really think have helped to propel gay and lesbian family law issues to the forefront of the movement, where again, it's not the only thing at the forefront of the movement. You know, we're now a movement where everything is on the table, and that's a great thing. But since 1981, we've also had the AIDS crisis. And AIDS forced people to come out all over the place. And it showed that we have families, and that we have families that stick by one another through thick and thin, through death. And this was news to a lot of people. They didn't know gay people had families. They didn't know they had relationships. Our office at GLAAD, even when I started in 1990, would receive calls from people who had been with their partners 24 years and were still having trouble getting into the hospital to visit their partner, who their partner had died, and the family swept in to clean out the house, saying, well, this is all ours, this is mine, who are you? You're a nobody. So I think that really helped to galvanize people to say, we have to fight for our families. And then there was also a case that some of you may have heard about, because it raged in the courts for 8 years and really became a focal point for many of us in the country. It was a case about 2 women in Minnesota, 2 gym teachers actually, just to get into stereotypes, 2 gym teachers who had been together for 4 years and had exchanged rings in a private ceremony, and one of them got into a terrible car accident and was disabled. And her partner's reaction was to go to the family and say, I'll be there for her, I'll take care of her. You should know that we were partners and I'm gonna stick with her. And the family's reaction was to go to court and get an order to keep her away from the partner who was now injured and disabled. And it took, to make a very long story short, it took 8 years, finally, for the partner who hadn't been in the accident to be able to assume guardianship and to be able to care for her family member. But the courts over the years were very insulting, and the family's wishes were given full sway. And I don't mean to just at all disrespect biological families. I'm actually very honored to have here with me today a member of my biological family, my Aunt Mary Kay Sawyer from Albany. But the thing about family is that we have been really trying to encourage the courts in the world to understand that we can also form families without biology and without marriage and without adoption. So those are some of the galvanizing forces, I think, about how we've gotten to where we are today. The other thing that I just cannot omit is that even though the court in Hardwick, the United States Supreme Court, thought that there was no connection between homosexuality and homosexual activity and procreation, for example, many commentators, social commentators, sociologists, have referred to the 1980s and 90s as a time when we are witnessing the creation of a whole entirely new concept of family, and the planned lesbian family in particular, where you have 2 women and also 2 men, I don't want to leave men out, who deliberately go off to create families with children on their own. And of course, gay people have always had kids, because many gay people have been previously married and had kids in the context of a marriage. But we're talking about something different here. I'm talking about planned lesbian families. I'm sure some of you have heard the term the gayby boom or the lesbian baby boom, but that is what has been happening for the last 20 years. And the thing about kids is once you have them, you have to come out. You know, you're obviously going to list your partner as the other contact for schools and for daycare. When you're in the grocery store and somebody says, oh, what a cute baby, whose is it? You know, you get into a discussion. You have no choice. You have to explain, well, it's actually both of ours, and, you know, since you asked, I'll tell you. So it has led to this unprecedented level of coming out, not only as individuals, but coming out as families. And the other thing that I have noticed, I'm not a parent myself, but one thing I've noticed about parents is they fight for their kids. They want to protect their kids. You know, I love seeing it. It's very admirable. And it's led to a certain amount of creativity, including creativity in the law. So what we have seen is when I started at GLAAD in 1990, one of the first, I came here in part to enforce the Massachusetts anti-discrimination law, but my very first day of work, I was called by a couple who had a child who at that point was 4 years old, and they wanted to both be parents of that child. One of them was the biological parent, and the other was a parent in every single way, but not a biological parent, and obviously not a parent under the law. And what we have seen in the last number of years is this new legal invention, again, called second parent adoption, where, to make a long story short, at the end of the day, you end up with two parents of the same sex. And frankly, in the law, that is revolutionary. And we have it now in Massachusetts and in Vermont, in New York and in New Jersey. It was actually a strategy that was pioneered out west, and there have been many of these kinds of adoptions granted in California and Oregon and Washington, Alaska. When the phenomenon jumped east in the early 1990s, we found ourselves in appellate courts pretty quickly, and now we have a number of courts, and Vermont was the first, on record respecting our families as they exist and acknowledging that they are families. So that in fact a child has, in law as well as in fact, two legal parents. And as a lawyer, I can just tell you that it is an astonishing development and a real breakthrough for us in terms of family law. Now, I'm going to just get right to marriage. And I want to tell you that I'm not a crystal ball kind of person, and I can't make too many predictions, but I do suspect that we are once again on the verge of ending discrimination in marriage in this country. And I say again because when we think about gay people not being able to marry, same-sex couples not being able to marry, this is not the first example we've seen of discrimination in marriage in this country. And for those people who are worried about our redefining marriage, I want to encourage them to just take a broader view and a historical view. I'll give you a few examples. If you think about this issue, think about eligibility for marriage. Who's eligible to enter into that state? Think about the fact that at various points in this country, in various states, African Americans were not permitted to marry, not even each other. That was wrong. We changed it. We redefined the institution. Later, when African Americans were permitted to marry each other, they were still not permitted to marry someone of the quote-unquote wrong race, meaning white people. Those marriages were considered by some states, by many states actually, by 30 at one point, unnatural, immoral, against God's wishes. Massachusetts criminalized interracial marriage until the 1840s. That was wrong. We changed it. Then, in 1948, California became the first state Supreme Court in the country to strike down an interracial marriage law. Okay, it was the first time we had a breakthrough in this front, and the California Supreme Court said the essence of marriage is to join with the person that you love. And for that reason, we're not going to allow the state of California to take race into account. 20 years later, almost 19 actually, the U.S. Supreme Court caught up and said that the freedom to marry belongs to all Americans. And at that point, 16 remaining interracial marriage prohibitions were struck down. So again, that's just one example of how marriage has been redefined with respect to eligibility. Think about the treatment of women within marriage over the years. That has changed radically. The notion that women are not solely the property of men in marriage is a relatively modern concept. Women at one point could not own property in their own names, could not contract. The idea that there would be such a thing as rape within marriage is a very recent concept. Husbands for many, many years were entitled to impose quote-unquote physical discipline on their wives, also with impunity. That also is wrong, and that has been changing over the years. One final example. Think about divorce, exiting from marriage, if you will, and how that has changed. There have been raging battles in this country about divorce over the years. There have been battles about what constitutes sufficient grounds for divorce. Can you have no-fault divorce? Now we have this idea of covenant marriage and really limiting exit from marriage in Louisiana. These battles really came to a fore in the Congress because there were some states that developed essentially cottage industries trying to grant so-called quickie divorces. And between the years of 1884 and 1946, there were a total of 73 efforts to amend the Constitution to give the federal government the power to create a uniform law of marriage and divorce. Again, this is not in our lifetimes particularly, not all of us, but this has been a raging battle about marriage and the exit from marriage. So again, when we talk about redefining, I just want to say, think about how marriage has been redefined over the years. And then one other thing I just have to say in this front, and this, again, the U.S. Supreme Court, I like to talk about them a lot. The last time that they actually heard a marriage case was in 1987. And when they last heard this case, there was a group of Americans who had restrictions on the right to marry, and they weren't happy about it. They wanted to be able to marry. And the Supreme Court said, well, let's look at what is marriage. What are the attributes of marriage? And we'll figure out, based on these attributes of marriage, whether or not you're entitled to enter into this state. And the court said, well, one attribute of marriage is emotional support and public commitment. Second one, that it can be spiritually important for people. Even if it's not religious, it can be spiritually significant to them. Third, there's the expectation for most of them that it would be consummated, and there'd be some sort of physical intimacy. And fourth, marriage in this society at this time, in 1987, the court said, was about the receipt of tangible government benefits and property rights, and this is a way of ordering your life. And looking at those four attributes of marriage, the court thought that this group of Americans shared the same interest in marriage as other Americans, and that the restriction on the right to marry was invalid. Who were these Americans? Got any guesses? Incarcerated prisoners in the state of Missouri, including felons and murderers. Now, however, 11 years later, in all 50 states, no matter how much a lesbian or gay couple needs the protections of marriage, wants to share in that commitment, they are denied from doing so. But when I started this discussion about marriage, I said all of this may change, and I think it very well may, once again. I don't really think anymore we're at a point where it's the question of whether we're going to win the right to marry. It's just a question of when. And right now, as we speak, there are 3 state Supreme Courts around the country deciding this issue. One's Alaska, one is Vermont, and one is Hawaii. And this is not a fluke. It's not just something that came out of the Pacific and Hawaii. This is really happening around the country. And I want to tell you a little bit about these cases because they all have certain common denominators. They all involve couples who want to marry for the same mix of reasons as non-gay people want to marry. They're all people who think that the choice to marry should belong to them and not to the state. There are couples who believe that the protections and responsibilities and benefits of civil marriage should be as available to them as they are to any other citizen in this country. And there are couples who think that they should not be disqualified from entering into this institution simply because they fell in love with someone of the quote-unquote wrong sex. So, each of these 3 cases asks the state, what is the reason? What is the reason that you need to discriminate against us? What is the big reason? We have guarantees of equality in state constitutions and in the federal Constitution. So what is the reason? How do you justify this unequal treatment? The case, and I'm going to give you the answers such as they are, okay? And you can judge for yourself. The first place we got an answer was in Hawaii. There's a case that's been pending there since 1991. In 1993, the earth moved because in 1993, the Hawaii Supreme Court said, this looks to us like sex discrimination. State, you better give a reason for this, and it has to be a compelling one. And that had never, ever, ever been thought of before. It was sort of a common sense analysis, and no state had ever really been taken to task for this kind of discrimination before. It took the state 3 years to go back to trial. They had to canvass the whole country trying to figure out what they were going to argue. And they finally came up with this answer. We have to keep discrimination in marriage and allow only opposite-sex couples to marry because a child is best parented by his or her two biological married parents. That was the answer. Okay? Now, even if you think, as I do, that opposite-sex couples can do a great job of raising children, it is certainly true that there are many opposite-sex couples who do not have children, who have no intention of having children, who haven't the capacity to have children. And there are many couples, of course, and individuals who are raising children on their own, or raising children after a divorce, or have adopted children. And it got to the point at the trial where the state's 4 experts each had to concede that this was true, and that gay couples were raising children, and that they were doing a great job. So, the judge took 3 months to sift through the evidence, looked at it all very carefully. This was no liberal judge, and concluded there was no reason, much less a compelling reason, for this discrimination to stand. So that's one case. And that's one answer that we waited for, of course, for a number of years. Now the case is in the Hawaii Supreme Court, and we're waiting for their final decision. The second case I want to talk about, and it's the most recent ruling that we've had, is from Alaska. And it was a trial court judge in Alaska. And it's a case that involves a gay male couple, Jay Browse and Jean Dugan, who've been together over 20 years, an accomplishment for any couple, I think. And in that case, and this resonates a little bit with Hardwick, the judge said, this court finds that marriage, i.e. the recognition of one's choice of a life partner, just like the language from Perez in California, is a fundamental right. The state must therefore have a compelling interest that supports its decision to refuse to recognize the exercise of this fundamental right by those couples who choose same-sex partners rather than opposite-sex partners. The state's reaction, they've now been asked, obviously, to give a reason, tell us the reason. The state's reaction is to go up to the Supreme Court and say, please, we do not want to have a trial. Reverse this ruling. We don't want to have to give a reason. They have no reason. They have no reason, just like Hawaii had no reason. They have no reason. They don't want to have to give a reason. They're looking for a way to get out of giving a reason. So that's where we are in Alaska. So let's get to the last state, which is Vermont, which is where we're working on a case known as Baker versus Vermont involving 3 same-sex couples, 2 lesbian couples and 1 gay male couple. This case, by the way, is premised on a very, very, actually one of the original parts of the Vermont Constitution, which says that the government was created for the common benefit of all citizens and not for the special advantage or emolument of any single person, family, or set of persons. And that has been interpreted by the Vermont courts as a very strong guarantee of equality that all citizens must be treated alike. Well, in the Vermont case, the state offered 7 reasons for its discrimination. I'm going to tell you what they are, okay? Buckle your seatbelt. Okay, number 1, marriage has to be for male-female couples only because marriage is intended to bridge the differences between men and women and unite them. Okay? Now, I have to tell you, the judge in this case, again, who was no liberal, said that sounds like a lot of sex stereotyping to me, the idea that men are one way and women are another way and that marriage bridges something between them. I mean, maybe it works for some people, but the idea that that's why all same-sex couples must be excluded it didn't work for this judge. Second, marriage laws must discriminate against gay people because marriage is intended to create both male and female role models for children. The judge also said that one was sex stereotyped, and it also obviously resonates with the Hawaii decision, or the Hawaii arguments. Third, marriage laws must discriminate because otherwise the institution of marriage will become unstable and destabilized. The judge again said, if the sole reason for discriminating is that you want to preserve something the way it was to keep it stable, that doesn't work for me either. This is an institution that has undergone change. I thought that was sensible. Fourth, the state argued, marriage laws must discriminate because the state wants to discourage technologically assisted conceptions. Okay? I guess premised on the notion that if more same-sex couples were able to marry, they would use technology more, and that was bad. Although we were able to show the court very readily that actually 1 in 8 heterosexual couples uses some sort of technology to conceive. So anyway, that one went down, didn't get anywhere. And then fifth, marriage laws must discriminate because other states, once we do this, other states might decide that they're going to discriminate against Vermont marriages. No basis for reality with this one either. I guess it's the idea that if Vermont enforces its constitution for its citizens and those citizens travel elsewhere, that they might get discriminated against. But the court said that's no excuse for us not to apply our constitution the way that we think is right. That also made sense. Sixth, marriage laws should discriminate because what we're doing is we're making a normative statement. Didn't say what the normative statement was. And the judge said, I don't even know what you're talking about. Okay, so that one was gone also. That brings us to number 7. And this is the biggie. Marriage laws must discriminate in order to further the link between procreation and parenting. What does that mean? What it means, I guess, is it mixes together the idea that same-sex couples cannot procreate genetically from their union with the idea that kids need a mom and a dad. Now again, this is coming from a state which was the first state in the whole country at the appellate level to recognize that 2 men or 2 women can be legal parents to a child, recognizing, of course, that our families do exist and already according them a certain amount of protection under the law. And again, ignoring the things that we talked about earlier about how there are plenty of different sex couples that do not procreate, can't procreate, won't procreate, have no intention of procreating, etc. So that's where we were left. That's what the judge said. And she said that she had to rule this way because she was, she had to bend over backwards for the state under the constitutional standards, which again, we think she was wrong about that, but she had to bend over backwards, so she gave them that one. So now we're on appeal in the Vermont Supreme Court, finishing up briefing. I assume we're going to have oral argument sometime in the fall. And all of these issues will be on the table. But the real question not only in Vermont, but in the whole country is, what is the reason that same-sex couples, that gay and lesbian people cannot enter into the institution of civil marriage? And I have to say, I think we're going to hit a lot of bumps. A lot of bumps in this battle. We've already seen an enormous backlash by some states and by the federal government saying we're not going to recognize your marriages, even though they don't even exist yet. But this is one of those issues that I am very confident that over time, because there really is no reason other than prejudice, that given the history of this country, that we have to win. Thanks a lot.
Well, it's a great privilege for me to be here sharing a panel with Mary. Up until today, I didn't know that Mary existed, but it seems to me that you cannot listen to somebody with such eloquence and good spirit, but in such a low-key, reasoned way, and not be convinced. And the wonderful thing is that more and more people are listening to people like Mary, and fewer are listening to the kinds of people who, when I was growing up in all this, had the stage. And we're making tremendous progress. I'd like to say, first of all, although I love my own mother, you want to adopt me? You'd make, I mean, what, anybody listening to this or meeting this woman and imagining that she isn't fit to be a wonderful parent is ridiculous. So as people get to know us collectively, and certainly people like Mary, we make progress. I want to go back a little bit, and let me start by saying I'm totally incompetent to be on this panel. I'm here because I was speaking to 2,000 people this morning at 8 o'clock on investments, and when Adam found out that I was going to be in Boston, he figured, well, we got a slot on the panel, and I don't have any expertise in this area. I'm wearing a ring, but we eloped, and we're not even sure if we want to officially get married. That's another issue, and my partner is in New York, so he can't have his say. But let me just, and I'm going to be brief because given my expertise in this, but around the late 60s, when I was still over there and struggling, no one in the world knew that I was gay, but I keenly knew it, and so on and so forth. One of the voices was Dr. I can't remember his first name, but Rubin, who wrote a book, huge best-selling book, called Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Sex, But Were Afraid to Ask. Well, I got a hold of the book somehow, and because that book, of course, was totally all right to buy. You couldn't. There were other books and sections of the library that, if there was such a section in the library, that I wouldn't even be caught dead near. But this book I was able to look at, And I turned to the little section on homosexuality and was informed, quite reliably, the man's a doctor. The book was a huge #1 bestseller for a long time. I was informed that gay relationships consist of basically two men meeting anonymously separated by a stall in a bathroom, and after 2 to 3 minutes, that's the end of the relationship. And that's it. And that was the entirety of gay relationships, which I found appalling, and certainly no reason to come out, which I hadn't done and had never. Anyway, that was kind of the line, and I know to some of you 1968 or 69 or whenever the book came out is like ancient Greece, but in fact it's not that long ago. And here we are, where the President of the United States, First Lady, the former governor of Massachusetts, and probably the current governor, I don't know what, but even the mayor of New York, who's a Republican, and certainly the president of Harvard, and President of Yale, President of Princeton, on and on. Most people, not all, but most people of goodwill, some Republicans, most Democrats, heads of corporations as kind of flaky and liberal as IBM and J.P. Morgan and Chevron, American Express and Disney and American Airlines and so on and so forth, have to one degree or another clearly bought into the notion that gays and lesbians have an important place in society and are contributing citizens and so on and so forth. And there are varying degrees of comfort with the notion of marriage, but the general notion that, hey, they're our friends and they're okay and we're part of the deal, that part has been accepted by a tremendous part of the country. I was delighted to have a chance to write what turned out to be an endless cover story in Harvard Magazine that came out in January. What was so great to me is that they put it on the cover and they gave it 14 pages. This was their idea, basically, on the, being gay at Harvard, partly about me, but largely I got to interview a lot of much braver, much more interesting people and weed them through the story. That Harvard would do that shows you, first of all, how far things have come. And the letters to the editor that came in the last issue were interesting. There were quite a few really nasty ones, quite a few nice ones. But the nasty ones, the great thing was, if you looked at them, there were a great many of them from the class of 34. And there was a few other classes, but the youngest person who wrote a really kind of negative letter about he's being sick and disgusted and so on and so forth, and cancel my free subscription, and just try to get off that mailing list, by the way. But the youngest person who wrote in a negative letter was 50, which I like to tell you is actually not so old. But the good letters came from people of all ages, and I gather, I haven't seen this next issue, but the new issue apparently has a whole new set of letters responding to the other letters. But the letter I want to mention, some of you may have seen, relevant particularly for those of you who are here this morning, came from kind of the modern day Dr. Rubin. There is a gentleman who's kind of incredibly famous in the world of psychiatry and I guess the world of gay rights and so on and so forth. Because he still believes, he's Harvard class of 45, and he still believes intensely and has written endlessly and has a very scientific background for it and so forth, that being gay is basically a mental disease and he can cure it. And he doesn't hate gay people, but he does feel that we clearly need to be cured, and he's available. And his name is Dr. Charles Socarides. It is a matter of some chagrin to him, I think. I don't know, I haven't talked to him, but I imagine that it's a matter of some chagrin to him that his son, Richard Socarides, who was here this morning, is the White House liaison to the gay and lesbian community and one of the great leaders of this gay and lesbian equal rights movement. And I think it's a matter of some chagrin to Richard, who's a friend of mine, that his dad happens to have this particular position. They love each other. At least I've talked to Richard about this, and the New York Times did an amazing profile of the two of them together. It's a bizarre situation. Richard loves his father, wishes his father well, but is embarrassed that his father happens to be, about as much of a troglodyte on this issue as anybody ever was, and his father presumably is a little embarrassed. And the reason I mention this is, Richard would never probably say it publicly, but it's just a fact. So and it's interesting. Not one of Dr. Socarides, psychiatrist Socarides Sr.'s 4 marriages has lasted nearly as long, let alone the other relationships, as long as Richard's 10-year relationship that he had at one point. And it's really possible for well-adjusted, nice, gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, and every other kind of people to form loving relationships that work. It's also possible to have terrible breakups and terrible problems and all sorts of things. But even for someone as brilliant and normal as Dr. Charles Socarides, class of 45, who wants to cure me of my miserable state, you know what? None of his 4 marriages worked, and not one of them lasted as long as young son Richard's relationship. So it seems to me that the issues of family and love and whatnot really transcend gender and sexual orientation and so on. And I don't think this is any longer such a new concept. So we're making a lot of progress. I must tell you that when I first heard the idea of gay marriage, I don't know, maybe 6, 8 years ago or something like that, I said, "Are you crazy?" But in terms of marketing, oh sure, gay marriage, but think of another word. Don't you realize that if all you do is change the word from marriage to something else, it's a relative piece of cake. It won't happen right away, but if it's just a matter of equal rights and so on and so forth, like ENDIT, eventually we're going to get ENDIT passed through Congress and the president has endorsed it and so on and so forth. But if you use the word marriage, I mean, everybody knows, and you've grown up, and we've all seen the wedding cakes, and all this, you just kind of know and all this stuff. And so here I was, relatively enlightened, only obviously, as you can tell, relatively, but certainly on the right side of these issues, or trying to be. But it just didn't ring right to me. I must tell you, I was told some of the name for this conference, or this, well, it's not up there, thankfully, but there's a word that some of you younger folks use for all this stuff that used to be the word that was a terribly offensive word, the last thing you wanted to be called. And I'm just, stolid enough to still find it awkward. I don't want to be called that. That's what you don't want to be called. And there are other kind of names I don't want to be called, By the same token, so words make, well, if it took me a while to get to the point where now of course, I realized I was an idiot, and Mary is completely right. I find myself realizing that a lot, on all sorts of issues, but imagine how long it's going to take some well-meaning, decent Harvard class of 45 alumnus, or Harvard class of 34 alumnus, or, there's some people who didn't go to Harvard. And, if you're a good, God-fearing whatever in Kentucky or anywhere, New York City for that matter, but any place, and it just takes a long time. And the wonderful thing is, in what may seem like a very long time to somebody who really wants to get married or wants to adopt and so on and so forth, and obviously these things shouldn't, ideally, they wouldn't take any time at all, but in what is really a relatively short period of time, we're making enormous progress. The second best, I think the best statement for gay marriage and adoption I ever heard may have been just now. It's just so nicely done. Second best, I didn't get to hear, but I've read several times, and I quote in the sequel to that book that Maureen talked about, came from a legislator in Iowa. Not Tom Harkin, who's senator from Iowa and a great supporter of gay civil rights, but from a state legislator. They have their own legislature in Iowa. And this fellow, Ed Fallon is his name. I've never met him. Subsequently, I've contributed a little bit to his campaigns because he came out on the floor of the Iowa legislature. He said, listen, you all know me a long time, and it's finally time, I guess, that I acknowledge that I'm a heterosexual. This was in the context of their debate where they were trying to basically ban if Hawaii does legalize marriage, Iowans want to make sure that it doesn't carry over to Iowa. And he came out as a heterosexual, and he explained, it went on really beautifully, but the bottom line, he said, there is no limit on the amount of love in Iowa. It's not, it's not a zero-sum game that if these people get married, those people can't get married, and on and on. So when you have straight legislators in Iowa getting it, and in fact, giving it back in a beautifully and eloquent way, we're going to get there. And it's astonishing, but this kind of event and this kind of wonderful advocate doing the work in the courts means to me that at some point, Charles and I'm going to have to figure out, we're going to have to talk prenups, and I can just see, you don't know Charles, but I can just see that negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Perhaps next year we can invite Charles to come and speak. We're going to open it up for questions, and people can ask questions from the 2 microphones. We would ask you to do that because we're getting recorded. And I'm going to start off by asking a question of Mary. I'm wondering if, Mary, if you could comment on the significance of social science in the effort to combat prejudice. I think when I read the Hawaii decision, it seemed that there was an enormous amount of expert testimony talking about the available social science about gay people raising children and whether this was absolutely terrible for children and what differences our families make and what they don't make. I just wondered if you could comment on the importance of the research in that area. Sure, I don't know if any of you. Oops, is that on? Maybe not.
Hello? Yes. Actually, maybe some of you are social scientists. It's actually turned out to be very important and have a terribly important role, and I'm glad you asked that question. Every single mainstream, reputable social scientist who has studied gay couples as parents, individual gay people as parents, has found that they are able to provide the same kinds of stable and loving homes as non-gay parents, and that the children of lesbian or gay parents turn out to be healthy and stable in just the same proportion as kids raised by non-gay parents. I know that that's shocking and counterintuitive to some people, but nonetheless, these studies date back, now some of them to the 1970s, and the American Psychological Association, which is a reputable organization, all of professionals, doctorate-level professionals, have reviewed every study. They've funded a lot of research themselves. They've actually become advocates for us because they have been so concerned about the misinformation about gay and lesbian people as parents and the role of some people, unfortunately, like the gentleman you mentioned, preying on fears and stereotypes to really take kids away from qualified parents, whether it's in the context of a divorce that ends because one of the parents is coming out, or some other context where social science, where fears and stereotypes and what we always assumed, well, gay people prey on kids, don't they? Isn't that what they do? You know, the APA has really been so concerned about that kind of mentality that it has really done its best to get out information. They published in 1995 something called Lesbian and Gay Parenting, a resource for psychologists, summarizing all of the studies, making conclusions, getting the information out there. And they actually have been a real counterpoint to an organization called NORTH, the National Association for the Research and Treatment of Homosexuality, in which Dr. Socarides, yes, is a board member, who believe that homosexuality is just plain old wrong and bad for you and an illness. And the American Psychological Association and Psychiatric Association, both in 1973, just said this is just not true. So anyway, social science information has been very important, but it's still, you know, you can take all the science in the world if someone's mind is closed to it, because they think they know best. Then it's not going to get through. But there has been a steady drip, and it is critical.
And I also agree. I think that it may not help those people that are so closed-minded, but I think it helps a great sort of perhaps a greater majority of folks that just perhaps are prejudiced because of ignorance, and they need that enlightenment and are open to change in their thinking. So, question?
Hi, my name is Jeff Quinlan, and I work at the School of Public Health, and I'm a student in the Extension School. And I'd like to ask Ms. Bonuto if she could speak a little bit to the future of the marriage legislation within each state, and then also what happens at the federal level in the event that one of the states does legalize same-gender marriage.
You obviously want me to keep you here for an hour. Okay, you asked, I'll tell you. Actually, there are now, I think it's 28 states that have adopted some kind of law either saying we don't want same-sex marriages in our state or saying that they would not recognize same-sex marriages performed elsewhere. And then, of course, in 1996, in the heat of passion around the presidential race and so on, we now have a federal law, the Defense of Marriage Act, which says the federal government will not recognize same-sex marriages and therefore shuts gay and lesbian people who marry out of the 1,049 federal benefits and protections of marriages, and for the first time ever puts the federal government on record saying it will not respect a certain class of marriages, something they did not even do, ever in our country's history, even when there were battles around interracial marriage. It's pretty extraordinary. But anyway, where are we going with this? I'll tell you where we're going with this. We're heading for a win. The question is the win in 5 years or is it in 50 years? And the reason that I think that we're headed for a win is because we are going to have a breakthrough in some state. Maybe it won't be Hawaii. I hope it is. Those people certainly deserve it. They deserve to be first. We all stand on their shoulders. But if it's not Hawaii, it will be some other state. This is a national movement at this point. There's been a national teach-in on gay and lesbian families and on marriage. When I myself have testified in state legislatures, for example, Rhode Island and New Hampshire, which last year both rejected these so-called state Defense of Marriage Acts, the reaction I got from legislators was, you people have a problem. I didn't know that you couldn't get in the hospital. I didn't know you didn't have the right to figure out where you wanted to bury your own partner. I didn't know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we've had this enormous teach-in. And public opinion, which is never quick to move, is moving. It is shifting. I don't live my life by polls. I feel like what you have to do is speak the truth. But I will tell you that right now, with polling, there's more acceptance for same-sex marriage than there was at the time that the United States Supreme Court issued its decision in Loving versus Virginia, striking down bans on interracial marriage. Okay? Anyway, so where we're headed is we have a breakthrough. We're going to have people going to that state and other states, I assume, to enter into marriages. They're going to be married. They're going to have marriage certificates. They're going to be as married as any people on the planet, civilly married. They're going to go home, and they're going to say, I'm married. And some of them, I think many of them, will encounter discrimination, if not from their state, then from institutions ranging from banks to hospitals to whatever. And the question then becomes, how do you respond to that discrimination? In part with education. Why are you not recognizing our marriage? We're married. We've always recognized marriages. That's what we do in this country. We don't have little, stations set up at borders trying to figure out if you're validly married or not. And eventually, because it is not, just to make this long story short, because it is not tenable to be in a state, in a country, where there are 50 states with 50 different laws on something that normally is transportable. You take your marriage status with you wherever you go. Because of that, ultimately this country has to reach a resolution. And I cannot help but think that that resolution is going to be in favor of marriages. I'm going to tell you a story. In 1819, there was a Massachusetts couple, an interracial couple, that went to Rhode Island to get married because they could not get married here. Because at that time, Massachusetts criminalized interracial marriage. When they came back, even though they had essentially evaded and violated the criminal laws of this state, the Supreme Judicial Court said, of course the marriage is valid. If it's valid where it's entered into, then it's valid when you get home. And that rule exists in some form in every single state. It happens to be a very strong and very well articulated rule here in Massachusetts. But when you take that basis of how, of course, this country has dealt with marriages, and then you add on to it things like guarantees of full faith and credit and equal protection of the laws and so on, it's a battle that ultimately has to be won. That's my hope, and that's my expectation. The question to me is it 5 years, or is it 15, or is it 50?
Question.
Yeah, I'm Adam Sofin. I actually have a question for Andrew Tobias. I know you talked a little bit about your book, Best Little Boy in the World, but I wonder if you could tell us a little more about that and some of the response you must have gotten from gay families in the last, in the years since it's come out.
Well, I don't want to turn this into a promo, but there was this book written by a guy named John Reed, not the communist John Reed from Reds, if you saw that movie, and not any of the 4 or 5 John Reeds who wrote really angry letters threatening to sue the publisher for, God forbid, someone. There are people in this country named John Reed. One of them is chairman of Citicorp, although he wasn't angry about it. But the world's changed enough that in the fall it's coming out to Modern Library, even though I'm not dead. Bringing it out, under my own name, and Random House is bringing a sequel. And one of the most satisfying things about the book has been, since it certainly wasn't royalties, this book, only 7 copies were ever sold, but they were passed around. And the pass-along readership has been amazing. So there have been no royalties, but the feedback over the years has been great, because there are people who read it when they were coming out and so on. The book really didn't talk about families, and I don't think it probably encouraged families, because at the time, it's hard for many of you to imagine, but at the time, there were basically no books about this. There were a couple, but there were no books about this. It was not unusual to use a pen name. It wasn't an act of unusual cowardice, just normal cowardice. The sequel, in fact, talks a lot about family. Talks about me and Charles, and we are essentially a family. It talks actually about, I have no social science research, but friends of mine named Joey and Laurent have 2 daughters, and there are so many different ways of doing this, and adoption in a world with so many wonderful kids needing to be adopted and waiting to be adopted, adoption is a great way to do it. And I have friends who are gay male couples and lesbian couples who have joined forces, and then that's a way to do it. But Joey and Laurent wanted to have kids and wanted to raise them themselves. They found a wonderful, very willing, lovely birth mother 3,000 miles away, and they supposedly they shook everything up in a test tube, so we don't know which daughter is whose, although I have my suspicions. And these are now, they're not the typical people, and I think typical gay and lesbians will make good parents as well. But just to take this case, Joey happens to be this amazingly successful guy who made a lot of money on Wall Street when he was younger, and he's devoted his life to ruining the tobacco companies, and he's made huge progress. He's one of probably the 10 people in the country who's done more on the tobacco issue than anybody else. And so these kids grow up with 2 wonderful parents in an amazing apartment in Manhattan, trilingual. They speak fluent French, because Laurent and Joey speak French a lot in the apartment. Fluent English, of course, because Joe is from Maryland and they live in America. Fluent Spanish, because the babysitter, they have no live-in help. They have no secret. They do everything themselves, but they do have a babysitter from time to time when they go out, and she speaks only Spanish. And the kids, maybe this may be terrible, but I don't think it's because they're gay. For whatever you think of this parenting idea, it's almost B.F. Skinner or somebody getting involved, but they decided that the kids should the only television they could see, they didn't want the kids, they're too young, they don't want them watching television, except for videos, and they only get to see Spanish videos. So, at one point they went to somebody else's house. They were astonished to find out that the television set can speak English. They thought the television could. So, I mean, here are these kids who've traveled around the world, who are trilingual. They're 5 and 7 years old, these daughters. They have 2 wonderful, loving parents who are brilliant and caring and all that. It's hard to look at this and say that, okay, I mean, there's no question they're going to have some issues, I imagine, as they grow up, the daughters. But you know what? Having some issues and having a little adversity or a little edge to your life, it's not the worst thing. I mean, if you're African American or Jewish or gay or lesbian, or by now, I imagine if you're a WASP, that's a bit of a, I mean, anybody has some edge or something that they have to deal with a little bit. I think it's hard to look at a family like that and imagine that it's, really disadvantaged or not worthwhile, which is obviously not on point. But that is in the next book. The sequel comes out in September, and it's under my own name, and John Reed has been retired permanently, for better or worse.
Okay. Over here.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Bilbeck. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. My question is for Ms. Bonato. The way I understood it in Hawaii, there's a referendum coming up in November where they can amend the Constitution. I wondered what would be the legal status if the Supreme Court ruled, say, next month, and people then got married this summer, and the earliest the referendum would be in November. What would be the legal status of the people who got married this summer, both in Hawaii and in their ability to challenge, go to the Supreme Court if they move to other states?
Sure, I'll give it a whirl. I'm glad you brought up the whole political dimension of Hawaii. I could have talked to you a lot about that as well, but I was trying to be somewhat respectful of the time here. One of the things that happened, of course, when we had this breakthrough in Hawaii and the trial court ruled what it did in December of '96 and said essentially, state, you have no reason, after thinking about it for 3 years and canvassing the country for experts, you have no reason. The right wing moved in great force, and they're very proud of it, by the way. They moved in great force and basically tried to take over the Hawaii State House and begged and pleaded that the Hawaii legislators cave in and put some sort of measure on the ballot, constitutional amendment on the ballot, pass it, and then it would go on the ballot for ratification by the voters to kill this marriage idea. And as part of their deal, they said, look, we'll give you domestic partnership. This is the right wing. This is the radical right wing in this country saying, give them domestic partnership. Give them the best domestic partnership we've ever seen in the whole country. You know, hundreds of rights, that's okay. These, of course, are the same people in every other state that are saying, hey, people, they don't have families. You know, it's an abomination. Never, not a single right ever, no families, whatever. So anyway, in Hawaii, they were trying to give away the store to keep marriage from happening. And in fact, by a fairly close margin, the Hawaii legislature did say, okay, we'll enact this fancy domestic partnership law, which is the best domestic partnership that exists anywhere in the country. It's not marriage. But anyway, we'll enact this law and we'll let the people decide this issue. So what happens in November, just to be perfectly clear, is that the Hawaii voters are voting on a measure which would allow the legislature, if it so chose, to restrict marriage to men and women only as a constitutional matter. If we were to lose the election in November, and of course that's not a foregone conclusion, but if we were to lose it, it would simply return the battle to the legislature, and then the legislature as a constitutional matter could say marriage in this state is for men and women only. Of course, we would attack that result, rest assured, because when you're fighting for equality, it doesn't, whatever mechanisms you use to try to defer equality will still be attacked. But anyway, we are waiting, of course, for the Hawaii Supreme Court to rule. It could rule before November. It might rule after November. We don't know. But should it rule, this is your question, should the Hawaii Supreme Court rule before November and say, that's right, marriage has to be available without discrimination based on sex, then you're going to have couples in Hawaii and elsewhere who are married. And if the voters then in November said, we want to return this whole issue back to the legislature, I would like to think that the Hawaii legislature would then have proof that the world did not end. The world did not end because same-sex couples were able to enter into the institution of civil marriage. And I would like to think that that actually be favorable and that the legislature would see proof that it was okay, that society persisted and thrived even with this, and that it was a good thing. So how it all stands legally, we're going to have to wait and see what happens and when it happens and how they do what they do. But I'd like to think that once couples get married, it will actually start strengthening our case because there will be real live examples of married couples. It'll really put a face on it.
You just think of all the new Crate and Barrel registrations. So, next question.
A boon.
A boon.
Hi, my name is Saru. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And this question is for you, Ms. Bonato. Sorry, it's a totally ignorant question, but sometimes an ignorant question sparks a good answer. So I'm wondering, as confident as you are in the success of achieving marriage laws, if you are equally confident in how many years the increase of scrutiny or suspect class status for gays and lesbians under civil rights laws across the board.
Sure. It's a great question. If I can just sort of pick up on your question and maybe flesh it out a little bit. When the government discriminates against people or classifies people, as it does, for example, in the United States military and says essentially openly gay people can't serve, or when you have constitutional amendments, for example, as you did in Colorado, that there could be no such thing as a claim of discrimination based on being gay or lesbian, you start getting into constitutional inquiries about whether or not this is justifiable. And when you get into those inquiries, of course, nothing's ever easy in the law, nothing's ever straightforward. So over the years, the courts have developed these mechanisms to say, well, if you're going to classify people based on their race, that's almost always presumptively wrong. And the state needs incredibly compelling evidence to justify that discrimination about why they need to do this. And again, Korematsu versus United States, the time when United States government interned Japanese Americans during World War II was the only time that we ever had a compelling interest. And of course, we know through history that we paid reparations for what happened in Korematsu and that that was wrong. So anyway, that's race. And there isn't any place where being gay has been treated like being a racial minority or classifying people based on race. No country, no court has yet done that, or if they've done it, it's never been upheld. And I have to say, in some ways, as somebody who actually works in this area of law, I actually am not incredibly concerned about making suspect class or heightened scrutiny kinds of arguments. To me, it seems, especially based on what the United States Supreme Court did in the 1996 decision of Romer versus Evans, that what the court is not interested in creating all these tiers. They actually realize, I think, that they've gotten things very complicated. And in the 1996 case of Romer versus Evans involving that Colorado constitutional amendment, the court essentially said that the Constitution neither knows nor tolerates classes among its citizens, and really used very broad concepts of equality to say this kind of singling out of gay people was wrong, and that the Colorado constitutional amendment was obviously based on animus and hatred and hostility toward gay people. It was an incredible breakthrough and an incredible insight by the court. It really showed between 1986 in Hardwick and 1996 in Romer how all of us coming out and being who we are has made a difference in educating, among others, the United States Supreme Court. So frankly, I'm not as focused on getting suspect class status. What I'm more concerned about is being able to convey a basic claim for equal citizenship under the law, regardless of how you dress, the constitutional language in which you dress it. The ultimate concept is equality. Maybe different, but we have the right to be equal. So I'm actually fairly hopeful about how Romer, there's a lot of debate about Romer, and some scholars think it's the worst decision they've ever seen, and it's sloppy, and so on. Leaving all that debate aside, there's no doubt that what the court hit on, and what I think many Americans feel, is we should all be equal in this country. We all belong to the human race. So that's what I hope we'll build upon. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Ron Selesky at the Fairbanks Center here. To Mr. Tobias, I'm one of the people who have enjoyed your book, Best Little Boy in the World, and it's a pleasure to see you here today. Actually, my question is for the other speaker, because that's good for you, isn't it? Yes. I'm interested in the Hardwick decision because, as you said, it was a 5-4 decision. And just after the decision, shortly after the decision came out, it seems to me, one of the justices who voted against it retired from the court, and he was asked about that, and he said in hindsight he feels he made a mistake in voting against the measure, in voting as he did.
But it didn't hurt anyone.
Pardon me?
But he said his mistake didn't hurt anyone.
Well, I was just hoping you might have some more details about that situation.
Well, I read the same comment. I know it appeared in the Washington Post. I cite it all the time whenever I have to talk about Hardwick. It was 5-4, and one person would have changed his mind. He realized he voted wrong. And I have to say, one of the things that just happened in the law is there was this development of privacy doctrine, and it stopped at Hardwick. And it stopped for a while, and it's been picking up again. And one of the fascinating things and a source of great debate among scholars is in the Romer decision, again 10 years later, the Colorado Constitutional Amendment case, the majority, it was a 6-3 majority. The decision was authored by a Reagan appointee, Justice Kennedy. The court never mentioned Hardwick. The majority never mentioned Hardwick. And some of the speculation is, that Hardwick was essentially overruled, even though they couldn't find 6 people to explicitly state that they were going to overrule it. Other people have said Hardwick is just going to, maybe if it wasn't overruled, it will shrivel away in its importance, because what the court got was the essential message of equality. Nonetheless, Hardwick remains on the books, and I can tell you that because of Romer, and again, I think because in many places, if not at the Supreme Court in 1986, but in many places, in many states, the idea that private adults should be able to do what they want to, consenting adults in their own homes, we have seen states like Tennessee and Montana and Kentucky strike down their sodomy laws. Some of them were same-sex only sodomy laws. So again, I think privacy has a lot of vitality in this country. The Romer decision, I think, really diminishes the significance of Hardwick, but it has still been there, and Hardwick has really been used to hurt people. It's been used to say gay is bad, to say you're bad, you're a criminal, I can take your kids away from you, you're obviously unfit. And while it's there, it is still really, I think, a thorn in our sides. But we certainly have Romer to point to now, and Romer has turned the tables. And now I think when we have discrimination against gay people, we get to say with Romer, you justify that discrimination, state. What is your reason for this? Is it about hostility? Is this about prejudice? Or do you have some good reason?
We have time for one last question.
I have a question for both panelists, and touching on some of the things that we've heard about the marriage case in Hawaii, but also since we're here at the Kennedy School, a lot of us are studying politics and organizing and things like that. One of the things that I think is unfortunate about some of the marriage issues is that a lot of us out in the communities tend to rely on skillful lawyers like yourselves to work on this impact litigation, and we're all sort of hoping that everything turns out okay in Hawaii and then it'll clear everything up. That concerns me because it seems to alleviate the pressure for us to fight in our own communities for a lot of these things, not just marriage, but fights on all sorts of fronts. So for all of the panelists, including Maureen, if you could just comment on the tension that exists between impact litigation and relying on impact litigation and what we should be doing in our own communities and families.
Well, I'm very happy to say as a board member of HRC that if anybody here is not a member of the Human Rights Campaign, you should join. And if anybody here has parents or siblings or friends, straight or gay, who aren't members, we're up to about 200,000 members. There should be millions of people in this country who feel for $25 a year, the way I always felt, and still do, of course, as a Caucasian, that civil rights are terribly important, and this is kind of a defining thing of my generation at Harvard, is I'm not African American, but my God, this is what we're all about. Well, there's still work to be done there, but here, so to join HRC, and to those of you who are involved with GLSEN and PFLAG and so on and so forth, even the with HRC, they are spending $1 million in Hawaii, or thinking about it, or I'm not sure exactly where it stands, but hopefully will be a lot of political support on this. But just having numbers, with most organizations you're trying to get as much money as you can, and HRC certainly needs money, but numbers count too. And to be able to say, hey, this is an organization of 1 million people, straight and gay, who care about this, instead of saying it's an organization of 250,000 people, and you all can make a big impact on that. Each of you could find 50 people. So that's my limit.
Yeah. I think that progress only happens when we have a diverse range of activism, and that I think the way many people feel like the Vietnam War would not have ended if people weren't out on the streets in addition to fighting in the courts and in the legislature. The same way that people think that we wouldn't have had civil rights protections for people of color in this country if we didn't have people sitting at lunch counters as well as doing the board versus education cases up in the Supreme Court. So, and I think it's the same way in our lesbian and gay and transgender and bisexual community, in that we need to have people out on the street protesting and having loud voices. We need to have people in the legislature either lobbying or being active participants, and we need to have people in the courts. So I think it's extremely important, and I think everybody has an impact just by being out.
And if I can just add, I really appreciate your question, and from my view, it's not a matter of a tension between impact litigation and political activism. It's a question of the maturation of this movement, and that we actually need to do both, and we need to get that. We need to stop thinking about the lawyers having the silver bullets that are going to solve the problems. In the same vein, we can't count on legislators and activism for everything. Sometimes lawsuits push things forward. I want to actually just tell you about Vermont, because in Vermont in 1995, we filed this case, this marriage case, in July of 1997. But in 1995, a group of Vermonters, calling themselves the Vermont Freedom to Marry Task Force, pulled themselves together and started going around talking to Rotary clubs, homemakers associations, government agencies, the Attorney General, about why they wanted to marry and why they thought, even if they didn't want to marry, why it was wrong that they were excluded from marriage. They got so excited they put together a video called The Freedom to Marry in Green Mountain View and started showing it all over the place. They actually helped to create the conditions which made it possible for us to file this lawsuit. And that's, I think, a great model for success, is the people telling the truth, speaking the truth about their lives as individuals and as couples and as families, working together with litigation. And I have to say to you, because of all of that work that's been done by Vermonters, not by lawyers, the anti-marriage bills that have been in the Vermont legislature for the last 2 years have been dead on arrival. They've gone nowhere because the legislators have heard it from us first. They said, oh, I've talked to those people. I know about that issue. Out of here. So I hear you that for some people there's a tension, but to me it's exactly the formula for success is both. And we've seen it work. It can work.
All right. I think that probably wraps it up, and I'll turn the podium over to Adam, and thank you to the panelists.
I just want to thank our panelists and our moderator again for coming today, and thank you all for coming. And I wanted to tell you, if you want to continue your activities today, we're screening a film at 7 o'clock. It's in Harvard Hall 104 over at the in Harvard Yard. And the film is called Very Queer Kids. Sorry about that. But by filmmaker Liz Reich, and she's going to be discussing the film afterward. And it's a film about Bagley, which is a gay youth organization here in Boston, one of the first of its kind in the country, and their efforts in the last few years. So I hope you'll all join us at 7 o'clock. Once again, thank you all for coming, and thank you to the panelists.